Fabia Whitlow sat in the dusty diner booth, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee in front of her. The world outside was dimming, the orange light of the afternoon sun creeping through the windows, casting long shadows over the faded wood floors. The train station was just 3 miles away, and in less than 3 hours she would be gone. She wasn't sure where she was headed next. Her fingers tightened around the crumpled train ticket in her pocket. $12 left her name. That's all she had. She had made her choice a few weeks ago to leave everything behind. She wasn't running towards something. She was running away from something. Away from the people who knew her. Away from the town that had cast its judgment on her. Away from a man who had torn her heart apart in front of the whole town. Her thoughts were interrupted by a small voice. "Do you want to meet my daddy?" Fabia blinked, her gaze falling on the little girl standing beside the table. She couldn't have been more than 6. Her copper curls bounced as she shifted from one foot to the other, oversized boots, clamping on the wooden floor with each step. Her bright eyes were wide and hopeful, searching Fabia's face for something, anything that might tell her if this stranger was a good choice. Fabia wasn't sure what to say. The last thing she wanted was to get involved with anyone in this godforsaken town. But the child's eyes, there was something about them that made Fabia hesitate. The desperation was clear in them. The loneliness, the weight of some kind of unspeakable sorrow. She wasn't sure why, but something pulled at her. She couldn't ignore it. "No, thank you," Fabia started to say, but the little girl took a step closer, her hand reaching out to tug at Fabia's sleeve. "Please," she whispered. "He doesn't smile anymore. Not since Mama left. But I think you might could help." Fabia swallowed hard. The words hit her like a punch in the gut. It was all too familiar, too much like her own broken heart, her own hurt that never seemed to fade. She could feel her own emotions, stirring, wanting to just walk away, to climb back into the shell she had carefully built for herself these past weeks. But the child's voice was soft, filled with a sincerity that made it impossible to turn away. "Daddy's ranch is just up the road. He's making supper, but it'll be burnt." Fabia's heart gave a sharp twist. She didn't need to know the details of this man's life to understand. The loneliness, the girl's words, her small, earnest plea, it all felt too familiar. She glanced toward the door of the diner, then at the clock on the wall. The train wouldn't wait, but she couldn't shake the feeling that leaving would somehow be worse than staying, at least for just a little while. Her eyes met the child's again, and she felt an inexplicable tug. The desperation in Amber's face made something in her stir. "I need to fix something to be useful. Again, even if only for a night, just for supper," Fabia found herself saying. Before she could stop it, her voice soft but firm. "Then I'm catching that train." Amber's face lit up with a smile that seemed to chase away the shadows in her eyes. "You won't regret it," she said, grabbing Fabia's hand and tugging her toward the door. Fabia stood up, her feet slow to follow. She felt the weight of the diner's eyes on her, the curiosity of the other patrons who had been watching the exchange. They didn't know her story, didn't know why she was here. And in some ways, she was glad for that. But she also realized something that made her chest tighten, a feeling that she hadn't had in a long time. Maybe she wasn't just passing through anymore. Maybe, just maybe, this town and these people might be a place to start over. Amber pulled her out into the dust-filled evening light, chattering away about her daddy, about how he used to laugh all the time before Mama left, about how supper was going to be so much better with Fabia there. Fabia smiled, faintly, the weight of her own baggage settling heavy in her chest. But she couldn't ignore the child's bright face, the innocence, the hope, the need. As they walked, Fabia's mind raced. She wasn't sure what to expect at the ranch or what kind of man this Dalton Reeves might be. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a simple dinner invitation. This was something she didn't know how to walk away from. Fabia glanced back one last time at the diner. The train station barely visible in the distance. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was running away from something. Maybe she could be running towards something. Maybe she was already too far gone to turn back. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start again. As they reached the end of the road, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance, and Fabia took a deep breath. Just for supper, she repeated to herself, more for comfort than for conviction. And with that, they headed toward the ranch where a new chapter of her life was about to begin, whether she was ready for it or not. Amber's little voice broke through the silence as she chattered away, her words tumbling out faster than Fabia could keep up. The dusty road stretched ahead of them, fading into the orange glow of the setting sun, and Fabia found herself trailing behind, letting the girl's innocent excitement pull her forward. Amber spoke of her daddy, Dalton Reeves, in a way only a child could. Carefree, full of hope, and utterly convinced that everything could be fixed with just the right kind of magic. Mama left 6 months ago, Amber said, her voice small but matter-of-fact, as though she had already come to terms with the pain. She didn't say goodbye, just packed her things and went. Daddy don't talk much. Since then, Fabia glanced down at the girl, noticing how her boots were too big, how her dress was faded from wear. Despite the sunshine, there was a heaviness to her words, something that wasn't meant for a child of her age. Fabia's heart tightened, but she didn't know how to comfort the girl. She didn't know how to comfort anyone anymore. As they walked, Fabia's mind wandered back to her own past. She had left Elias Grafton's house in the small town 3 weeks ago, escaping the embarrassment that came with being publicly humiliated. He called off their engagement in front of the whole town, telling her that she was too broken to be anybody's wife. That had been a crushing blow, the worst kind of rejection. She had wandered ever since, moving from place to place, too ashamed to stay in any one place long enough to let anyone see how damaged she truly was. She hadn't known what else to do. There was no home for her anymore, no place where she felt she belonged. But Amber made her think about home. The small girl's innocence stirred something in Fabia, a desire to protect, to care for someone who needed her. But there was also fear. What if she failed? What if she wasn't enough? I've been praying for someone nice to come, Amber said, breaking into Fabia's thoughts. Then I saw you, and just knew. Fabia looked at the girl, surprised by her honesty. Why me? She asked quietly. Amber shrugged, her curls bouncing. I don't know. You just look like you could help. The words cut deeper than Phoebe expected. She wasn't sure if she could help anyone. She wasn't even sure she could help herself. But she couldn't shake the pull toward this little girl. The need to be something for her, anything at all. As they walked, Fabia could see the ranch in the distance. It was a long, low building with a few barns and a faint trail of smoke rising from a chimney. The place looked weathered but sturdy, like it had been through its own share of storms. That's Daddy's ranch, Amber said, pointing ahead. He's making supper, but it'll probably be burnt. He's not good at cooking. Fabia smiled faintly, already feeling the weight of the small town that awaited her. The sense of isolation was tangible, like it hung in the air. The dirt road, the emptiness stretching for miles, the lack of any real connection. She was used to it, but she had never been so aware of it as she was now. Amber skipped ahead, her voice turning lighter as she spoke about the animals on the ranch, the horses and cattle, and how she helped feed the chickens in the morning. Fabia listened, nodding occasionally, though her thoughts were elsewhere. She had no idea what she was walking into, but something about the simple life Amber described felt like a balm to her weary soul. They reached the gate, and Amber paused to look up at Fabia. Daddy's going to be surprised, she said, her expression suddenly serious. You don't know I invited you. Fabia's stomach nodded. She had assumed Amber's father would know she was coming, that this had all been arranged somehow. But now she wasn't so sure. What kind of man would be surprised by a stranger showing up at his home? Her heart raced, but she didn't have time to question it further. Amber had already pushed the gate open, and Fabia found herself following the girl up the short path toward the house. The front porch was lined with old rocking chairs, a few of which creaked in the wind as they walked by. Daddy, Amber called, her voice high and eager. Fabia stepped up to the door, feeling the coolness of the evening air against her skin. She hesitated, her hand resting on the door frame. But before she could knock, the door swung open. Dalton Reeves stood there, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He was a man in his mid-30s with rough hands and a weathered face that spoke of hard work. His eyes, however, were what caught Fabia's attention. They were a deep brown, haunted, as if they had seen too much for one lifetime. His shirt had flour stains on it, and his hair was tousled from a long day's work. The sight of him standing there so unexpectedly made Fabio pause. He looked down at Amber first, then at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Amber," he said, his voice deep but tinged with concern. "Who's this?" Amber beamed up at him. "This is Miss Fabia. I brought her to help." The silence stretched between them, awkward and thick. Fabia could feel the weight of his gaze, and she was acutely aware of the tension that had settled in the air. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but Amber's bright eyes were already looking up at her father, hopeful and eager. And suddenly she couldn't walk away. Not now. Not with this little girl. Depending on her. "I'm sorry," Fabia said, her voice unsure. "I didn't mean to intrude." But before she could finish, Amber grabbed her hand and pulled her inside. "Daddy, don't worry," she said. "She's going to help with supper." Fabia glanced at the messy kitchen, the burnt pot on the stove, and the overwhelming sense of disarray that seemed to hang in the air. She felt the weight of her own uncertainty and a flicker of something else. Something dormant inside her, a need to be useful, to help. The words came before she could stop them. "I'll help with supper," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Just tonight." Dalton looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but genuine. Fabia rolled up her sleeves and walked toward the stove. Amber's smile was radiant, and for the first time since she had arrived in town, Fabia felt like she was doing something right. That first night, supper turned out to be surprisingly pleasant, despite the awkwardness that hung between Fabia and Dalton. She helped salvage the burnt pot roast, and together they managed to make a meal that, while simple, was filling. Amber chattered the whole time, her voice light and full of questions, but Dalton mostly stayed quiet, watching Fabia from across the table. There was something in his gaze that made her self-conscious, as though he was studying her, trying to understand what kind of woman had walked into his home. After dinner, Amber begged her to read a bedtime story, and though Fabia felt an overwhelming urge to leave, knowing she had no place here, she found herself sitting at the edge of the little girl's bed, reading from a book that Amber had obviously worn thin with use. A storm was brewing outside, the wind howling against the windows, and as the last page turned, Dalton appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You can stay the night," he offered, his voice low. "The roads won't be safe tonight, and it's a long walk back to the diner." Fabia hesitated. Her instinct was to leave. She always left, but something in Dalton's tone, his simple offer of shelter, made her pause. She nodded reluctantly. "Just for tonight," she said, not quite believing the words. The room was small but comfortable, and as she lay down, she thought about the day's events. She hadn't planned to stay this long, but there was something about this place, about Amber and Dalton, that made her feel something she hadn't in a long time. The possibility of belonging. Over the next few days, the boundaries between guest and family began to blur. Fabia found herself helping with breakfast, the scent of eggs and bacon filling the air. Every morning, Amber would crawl into bed with her, her small face inches away, asking, "You staying?" Every time, Fabia would answer, "Just for a little longer." Though it was becoming harder to keep that promise, the days turned into weeks, and every morning, Fabia would find herself sitting at the kitchen table with Amber, braiding the girl's hair while they talked about everything and nothing. Amber told her stories of her mama, of how she always wanted to be something more than a ranch wife, how she couldn't handle the isolation and hard work. Mama said she wasn't made for ranch life. Amber confessed one morning as Fabia braided her hair. She said, "Some people are built for leaving." The words hit Fabia hard. She understood that feeling all too well. The fear of staying, the belief that you would never be enough. She had fled her past, believing that if she stayed in one place, it would consume her and she would never be anything more than the person who had been humiliated. Amber's innocent observation cut deep. "You look sad too, just like Daddy," Amber said one afternoon as she watched Fabia quietly mending a shirt. Fabia froze, feeling the sting of that simple truth. She had been hiding her sadness, tried to keep it buried beneath a surface of calm, but Amber had seen through it. Fabia smiled, weakly, but it wasn't a smile that reached her eyes. That night, as they sat around the table, Dalton began to open up in a way that surprised her. He spoke of his wife, how she had left him because he couldn't provide her with the life she had wanted. She wanted more, he said, his voice rough. "But I couldn't give it to her. I wasn't enough." Fab is hardtack. She knew exactly what he meant. She had been told the same thing by Elias, that she wasn't enough. She swallowed the words, choking her, but she couldn't find the strength to speak. Dalton's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, she saw something there. Recognition, understanding, and something more. A dangerous attraction, one she wasn't ready to acknowledge, but it was there, lingering between them, undeniable. The days passed slowly, and Fabia found herself drawn deeper into the rhythm of life on the ranch. She helped with the morning chores, feeding the chickens, and teaching Amber her letters. She mended clothes and cleaned the house. But more than anything, she found herself becoming a part of the family in ways she hadn't expected. Every night, she and Dalton would sit on the porch, the silence between them comfortable, though the air between them seemed charged. There were small touches, passing dishes, their hands, brushing, lingering glances that neither of them acknowledged, but both felt. Every evening, she would make dinner, and they would sit together at the table, Amber telling stories about her day, while Dalton listened quietly, his gaze often lingering on Fabia. It was the kind of domestic routine she had never imagined herself in, but somehow felt right. In those moments, she forgot about the train ticket in her pocket, the plans to leave. She wasn't sure when it happened, but the desire to escape had slowly begun to fade. That night, after Amber had fallen asleep, Fabia sat on the porch steps, counting the money in her pocket. There wasn't enough for a train ticket to anywhere, at least not anywhere she wanted to go. She had always thought she was just passing through life. But now, sitting on the porch, watching the stars appear in the night sky, something had changed. She wasn't sure when it had happened, but she realized she wasn't ready to leave. Dalton stepped out onto the porch, his boots scraping the floorboards, and, without a word, handed her a cup of coffee. He sat down beside her, his presence warm and steady. Neither of them spoke at first, but the quiet was different now, comfortable. She looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see a man who was broken by the past. She saw someone who had been hurt, yes, but who had also found a way to keep going. And for the first time since she had arrived in this town, she didn't feel so alone. The next morning, as Fabia helped Amber with her breakfast, Dalton mentioned that they needed to go into town. Amber had outgrown her shoes, and it was time to get new ones. Fabia felt a flicker of unease at the thought of venturing into town. The last thing she wanted was to face anyone who might recognize her. She wasn't ready for that. Not yet. But she couldn't say no to Amber's excited chattering. Her enthusiasm too infectious to ignore. "It'll be fun," Amber promised, her face bright with hope. Fabia sighed and nodded, resigning herself to the idea. They climbed into the old wagon, the rickety wheels creaking as they made their way down the dusty road, passing by fields and fences that stretched as far as the eye could see. Amber sat between them, asking question after question, while Dalton remained quiet, his gaze focused on the path ahead. The closer they got to town, the more Fabia's anxiety grew. She hadn't been back since the scandal, since Elias had torn her apart in front of the entire town. The memory of the humiliation of being the talk of every gossiping woman in the county still stung. She had hoped the small town would forget about her, that she could slip away unnoticed. But as they pulled in the main street, she realized that small towns never forget. Every eye in town seemed to be drawn to them, lingering just a bit too long, like people were trying to figure out who the stranger was in their midst. At the general store, a few familiar faces greeted Dalton, their smiles friendly, but cautious, as if trying to size up the situation. Amber proudly introduced Fabia to anyone who would listen, her bright voice cutting through the murmurs of the townfolk. "This is Miss Fabia. She's staying with us." The comment started low, but audible. Whispers behind hands, eyes darting between Dalton and Fabia. Some were warm, friendly even, but there were others who seemed skeptical, their gazes sharp with suspicion. Fabia couldn't help but feel like she was being dissected, weighed, and measured by the very people who had once known her, who had watched her fall apart. The tension in the air was thick, and then, of course, Elias Grafton appeared. He was with a woman, someone Fabia didn't recognize, but who looked polished and perfect. Elias's eyes fell on Fabia, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. His reaction was immediate, shock followed by an unmistakable gleam of amusement. "Fabio Whitlow," he said, his voice louder than necessary, drawing the attention of the people around them. "I see you're back. Didn't think you'd land so quickly on someone else's ranch." The implication hung in the air like a bad smell, and Fabia's stomach twisted. She could feel the heat in her cheeks, the humiliation flooding back as if it had never gone away. The woman at Elias's side looked at Fabio with raised eyebrows, but Elias was too focused on her notice. "You know, I thought you'd be gone by now, but I see you found yourself a new man." His gaze flicked to Dalton, his smile turning more smug. "Tell them, Fabia," he pressed. "Tell them. What happened?" Amber, sensing the tension, looked up at Fabia with wide, innocent eyes. "Do you know Miss Fabia?" she asked, her voice high and curious. Elias leaned down as if to give an answer. But before he could speak, Dalton stepped forward. "We're done. Here," he said, his voice firm, cutting through the moment like a knife. He placed a protective hand on Fabia's back, guiding her away from Elias and his cruel remarks. The whispers followed them, and Fabia could feel the eyes of the townspeople on her as they made their way back to the wagon. She didn't say anything, couldn't bring herself to speak. The humiliation from the past still felt fresh, and Elias's words were like salt in an open wound. Amber, confused by the sudden change in atmosphere, glanced up at her. "Are you okay, Miss Fabia?" she asked. Fabia nodded, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she said, but the words tasted hollow in her mouth. As they climbed into the wagon and started back toward the ranch, the weight of the town's judgment hung over her like a dark cloud. The whole ride back was silent, and Fabia could feel Dalton's eyes on her, though he didn't say anything. He had seen the way Elias had treated her, the way the town's people had stared, and she could tell he wanted to say something, but he held back. When they arrived back at the ranch, Amber bounded off the wagon and ran toward the house, her bright energy unfazed by the tension of the day. Dalton and Fabio were left standing in the yard, the quiet stretching between them thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Dalton spoke. "You want to talk about it?" His voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, something that made Fabio want to run. She shook her head, too tired, too worn to face any more of the past. "I should leave," she whispered. "I told you I was only passing through." Dalton's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening as he stepped closer. "That man's opinion doesn't matter here," he said firmly, the words like a shield. But Fabian knew the truth. The town wouldn't forget. She would ruin Dalton's reputation if she stayed. They would talk, they would gossip, and everything would fall apart. But even as she stood there feeling the weight of Elias's cruelty and the judgment of the town, she couldn't bring herself to leave. Not yet. Not with Amber's bright eyes looking at her with so much hope. She had to make a choice. Leave and be alone, or stay and risk everything for something she wasn't sure was even real. As they walked inside, the weight of her decision pressed down on her, and she realized for the first time that it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Amber. It was about Dalton. It was about the life she had started to build. Fragile, uncertain, but somehow worth fighting for. And as the doors shut behind them, Fabia knew that she couldn't walk away. Not yet. Not now. The next morning, Fabia awoke to find the house unusually quiet. Amber wasn't in the kitchen, and Dalton was already out in the barn, his boots thumping softly against the wooden floor. Fabia felt a sense of unease creeping over her. The house felt too still, too empty, and when she couldn't find Amber after searching through the house, a cold knot formed in her stomach. She stepped outside, calling for the little girl, her voice carrying across the yard, but there was no answer. Panic began to set in as she walked to the barn, hoping to find Amber there, but the barn was just as quiet. Amber, Fabia called again, her heart racing. She moved toward the loft, the air heavy with the smell of hay and dust. A soft sound, like a muffled sob, reached her ears. She looked up and saw a small figure huddled in the corner of a loft, her face strewn with tears. Amber had hidden herself away, curling into a ball, trying to make herself as small as possible. Fabia's heart broke at the sight. She rushed up the ladder, her hand reaching for the child, who flinched away from her touch. Amber, what's wrong? Where have you been? Fabia's voice was gentle, but it trembled with worry. Amber's small frame shook as she cried, her face scrunched in confusion and sorrow. I thought I messed it up, she whispered between sobs. I thought I ruined everything, just like Mama did. Fabia's chest tightened. She had no idea what the child was talking about, but she could see the hurt in Amber's eyes. What do you mean? She asked, her voice soft as she sat beside the little girl. Amber wiped her nose on the sleeve of her dress, her voice cracking as she spoke. Mama left because I wasn't good enough. She left and went away, and now you're leaving too, aren't you? The words pierced through Fabia like a knife. She hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared herself for Amber's grief. She had no idea how to make it better, how to explain that she wasn't leaving. Not really. Sweetheart, Fabia said, her voice thick with emotion. She reached out, pulling the girl into her arms. You don't have anything to do with your mama leaving. Sometimes adults make broken choices, but that's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong, Amber. The little girl hiccuped, sniffling as she pulled away slightly to look at Fabia. But you're leaving just like Mama, Amber insisted. I can tell you just like her. You'll go, and then I'll be alone again. Fabia's heart broke all over again. She wanted to deny it, to tell Amber she wasn't going anywhere, that she had no intention of leaving. But the truth was, she wasn't sure. She had been running for so long, afraid of being hurt again, afraid of letting anyone in. But now, as she looked at the little girl clinging to her, she knew she couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when she was needed. No, Fabia whispered, her voice breaking. I'm not going anywhere. I'm right here. Amber's small hands grasped her sleeve as she buried her face against Fabia's shoulder. You promise? She asked, her voice small, fragile. Fabia swallowed, hard, nodding. I promise I'm not leaving. But just as the words left her mouth, she heard footsteps outside the barn, and Dalton's voice called out to them. He stepped into the barn, his eyes immediately landing on Amber and Fabia. There was a moment of quiet. Then Dalton stepped forward, his expression softening as he looked at Amber. Then at Fabia. He had heard everything. Amber, he said, his voice gentle but firm. You don't have to worry about that. You didn't make your mama leave, and you're not going to make anyone leave now. Amber looked up at her father, her eyes wide with confusion. But Miss Fabia, she started, but Dalton knelt down beside her, cutting her off. No one's leaving, he said, his voice rough with emotion. He glanced at Fabia, his gaze intense. Not you. Not now. You're part of this family, Fabia. You belong here. The words hung in the air between them. And for a moment, Fabia felt like she might shatter. She had been running for so long, afraid to let anyone see her as. She truly was afraid to believe that she could belong anywhere. But now, with Dalton's words ringing in her ears, the wall she had built around herself began to crumble. Amber's tear-streaked face looked up at her, her expression softening. "You're really not leaving?" she asked again, her voice full of hope. Fabia looked down at her, at the girl who had saved her from her own fear. She had been so afraid of getting close to anyone, of letting herself feel something real again. But Amber had pulled her in, and now with Dalton's quiet support, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. "I'm not going anywhere," Fabia said, her voice steady now, full of conviction. She stood up, wiping the last of the tears from her eyes. "I'm staying. I promised you, didn't I?" Dalton stood as well, and for the first time since she had met him, Fabia saw a hint of a smile on his face, something that spoke of relief, of hope. He took a step closer to her, his presence warm and solid. "Then we'll make this work," he said, his voice low but strong. "We're not going to let the past define us. Not anymore." The words hung in the air, and Fabia felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The past was heavy, but it didn't have to be the thing that controlled her future. She wasn't just passing through anymore. She was staying. And for the first time, she felt like she might actually be home. Just then, a voice called out from the house, and Fabia looked up to see Amber running toward her. "You're really staying?" Amber's voice was full of excitement, and before Fabia could answer, the little girl threw her arms around her in a tight hug. Fabia smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I'm really staying," she whispered, hugging Amber back. And for the first time in a long while, she believed it. She wasn't running anymore. She was home. That night, after Amber had fallen asleep, Fabia sat on the porch, the cool evening air brushing against her skin, but it couldn't soothe the turmoil inside her. The conversation with Dalton earlier had settled something deep within her. Yet, the fear of staying was still there, creeping in the corners of her mind. She had spent so long running, convincing herself that she was too broken to belong anywhere, that she wasn't enough to stay anywhere. Long term, she had let herself believe that it was better to leave before anyone could truly see her, truly know her. But everything had shifted. Dalton's words echoed in her mind. His simple declaration that she belonged here, that she was part of this family. She had never felt that before. Not from Elias, not from anyone. She had always been the one who didn't fit, the one who was too much or not enough, the one who always left before anyone could hurt her. Yet now, with Dalton's presence beside her, his quiet but steadfast support, she felt something stirring, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The desire to stay. She thought about the life she had found here, the simple rhythms of ranch life, the quiet comfort of daily routines, the warmth that Amber had brought in her heart. She wasn't just helping anymore. She was a part of something. But still, there was the fear that staying meant eventually facing rejection, that Dalton might see her as the damaged woman Elias had once labeled her. What if he changed his mind? What if he realized she wasn't what he needed? But then in her mind's eye, she saw Amber's face the way the little girl had looked at her with so much hope in her eyes. "You're really staying?" Amber had asked, her voice filled with the purest form of belief. And Fabia had answered, "I'm really staying." But now, sitting alone on the porch, she wasn't sure she was ready to admit it to herself. She had spent so long believing that leaving was the only option, the only way to protect herself from the hurt that had followed her for years. But what if staying was the answer? What if this was the place where she could finally heal? As she sat there, thinking about the weight of her choices, her eyes wandered toward the horizon. The stars were just beginning to show, the sky turning deep purple, and the night was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves. The distant sound of the wind moving through the trees seemed to match the quiet turmoil inside her. Her gaze fell to the small carpet bag, resting by the door, her ticket to anywhere, her escape, if she chose it. She had it all planned out. One last goodbye, one last quick departure, and then she would fade in the next town, the next place like she always did. But she wasn't sure anymore. The thought of leaving again, of walking away from this little family she had found, filled her with something far worse than the fear of rejection. It was the fear of never giving herself a chance to be something more. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, letting the cool night air fill her lungs. The pain, the shame, it all felt so far away here. There was something about the simplicity of this life, the way everything seemed to slow down that made her feel like she could finally breathe. And in that moment, Fabian knew what she had to do. The decision wasn't just about staying or leaving. It was about choosing to believe in herself again, to stop running from the idea that she was worthy of love, of belonging. It was about trusting that Dalton saw something in her beyond the past, beyond the thing she had been told she was. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, casting its warm light over the ranch, Fabia stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast for Amber, just as she had done for the past week. The smell of bacon and eggs filled the air, and as she glanced toward the window, she could see the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. She reached for the coffee pot, but her hand froze as she noticed her carpet bag by the door. The sight of it sent a pang through her chest, a reminder of the life she had once thought she would return to. She had promised herself she wouldn't stay in one place for too long, that she would keep moving, keep running. But something inside her was different now. She looked at the bag, then at the kitchen around her, the warmth of the stove, the sound of Amber's voice coming from the hallway, the steady presence of Dalton outside. This was her life now, whether she was ready to accept it or not. Her heart raced as she walked over to the bag, her fingers trembling as she unzipped it. The weight of the decision hit her all at once. She could leave, walk out the door, and catch the next train out of town, but it would be a lie she had been telling herself for so long. The truth was she didn't want to leave. Not anymore. Not when there was a chance to build something, to be part of something real. She slowly opened a dresser drawer, placing the bag inside and pushing it to the back. The weight in her chest lightened, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief. She was staying. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew this was where she was meant to be. Just as she finished putting the bag away, Amber bounded into the kitchen, her face lighting up when she saw Fabia. "You're still here," she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. Fabia smiled, her heart swelling with affection for the little girl. "I'm still here," she said softly, kneeling down to Amber's level. "And I'm not going anywhere." Dalton appeared in the doorway, his eyes meeting Faba's with something unspoken between them. She smiled at him, her heart skipping a beat. "I am staying," she said, this time with conviction. Dalton's expression softened, and for a moment, Fabia saw something that made her believe in this second chance. He stepped toward her, his hand brushing against hers in a simple touch that said more than words ever could. "I'm glad," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. And just like that, Fabian knew she had made the right choice. She was staying, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was finally home. 2 months had passed since Fabia made her decision to stay. The days seemed to blend together, each one full of the quiet rhythm of ranch life, each one drawing her deeper into a sense of belonging that she hadn't thought possible. She had gone from being a stranger in a strange place to someone who was woven into the very fabric of the family she had never known she needed. Morning started with the soft sound of birds' song outside the kitchen window, and Fabia could always count on Amber being the first to rise, her small feet pattering across the floor as she came into the kitchen to help with breakfast. The routine felt so natural. Now, like it had always been this way. Amber would ask questions, her curious mind constantly seeking answers, and Fabia would answer as best as she could, though sometimes she found herself learning from the little girl as much as Amber learned from her. They had their moments of joy, of quiet laughter, of shared glances across the dinner table. And then there was Dalton. He had become a steady presence in her life, the one person who seemed to understand the weight of the past without needing to ask questions. His quiet support, his gentle encouragement made Fabia feel more whole than she had in years. She had come to understand him in ways she hadn't anticipated. He had his own scars, his own burdens, but he carried them with a strength that made her want to be strong, too. The silence between them, once heavy with uncertainty, had become comfortable, full of unspoken understanding. They were building something together, something fragile but real. It wasn't just about the chores they did, the quiet meals they shared, or the way they helped Amber grow. It was about the way Dalton would stand in the doorway after a long day, watching her as she went about her work. The way his eyes would linger on her when she wasn't looking, as though he were seeing her in a way that made her feel like she finally mattered. Their touch had become more familiar, brushing past each other in the kitchen, the passing of a dish, a hand brushing lightly against hers. There were small moments of connection that neither of them acknowledged outright, but that filled the air with something unspoken, something that neither of them was ready to name. And then there were the evenings. After Amber went to bed, the house would settle into a peaceful quiet. Fabia would find herself sitting on the porch swing, staring out at the stars as the night wrapped itself around the ranch. Dalton would often join her, a cup of coffee in hand, and they would sit together, the silence between them, as natural as breathing. There was something calming about those moments, something that made her feel like she was where she was supposed to be, like the world outside didn't matter. It was just the two of them, the stars above, and the quiet of the night. The thought of leaving seemed foreign now, something that no longer made sense in the context of the life she was building. There were still times when the fear crept back in, moments when she thought about the possibility of rejection, of losing the love and security she had found. But every time that doubt surfaced, it was met with the reality of her life here. Amber's bright smile on the morning, Dalton's steady presence, the warmth of a home that had slowly begun to heal her. Broken pieces. She had come to this town with nothing but a ticket to nowhere in. The shame of a past she couldn't outrun. Now, she had a family, a place where she belonged. She had finally started to believe in herself again, and the possibility of a future that didn't revolve around running. The change wasn't just in her, though. Amber had flourished in the time that Fabia had been there. Her energy more vibrant, her laughter more frequent. She had grown, more confident, her innocence untainted by the fear that had once lingered in her eyes. In Dalton had softened in ways Fabian never expected. She had seen the way he would watch Amber with pride in his eyes, the way he would protect her with a fierceness that only a father could understand. But there was also a tenderness in him that he had kept hidden, a gentleness that Fabia had come to know and cherish. She could see the change in the way he looked at her, the way his gestures had become more intentional, his touch lingering just a little longer than necessary. He had never been one for words, but there was a depth to the way he showed affection through small acts of kindness, through the way he respected her space while never leaving her side. As the weeks passed, Fabia couldn't ignore the growing connection between them. She had tried to push it away to convince herself that it was just the isolation of the ranch, just the quiet that made everything seem more intense. But the truth was undeniable. She cared for him in ways she hadn't allowed herself to care for anyone in a long time. And as the day of Amber's birthday approached, Fabia felt a shift inside her, a realization that had been creeping up on her over the past few weeks. The small, simple moments they had shared dinner, around the table, quiet walks through the fields, the way their hands brushed, had woven something strong between them. It wasn't just about being a part of this family anymore. She was in love with Dalton, and though she hadn't said the words aloud, She knew deep down that he felt the same way. The morning of Amber's birthday arrived, and the house was alive with excitement. Amber had been counting down the days, her energy infectious as she talked about the party. She had imagined. It wasn't much, a small cake, a few gifts, the family gathered together. But to Amber, it was everything. Fabia had spent the previous night baking, making a cake that was far from perfect, but made with care. It wasn't much, but it was the best she could do. She had also found a small locket at the local shop, something simple but meaningful. When Amber came into the kitchen that morning, her face lit up with joy, and Fabia couldn't help but smile. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," Fabia said, her voice warm. Amber threw her arms around Fabia's waist, squeezing tight. "Thank you, Miss Fabia. This is the best birthday ever." The morning passed in a whirlwind of cake and presents, laughter and hugs. And then, as the sun began to set, Dalton led Fabia outside, his hand warm against hers as they walked toward the barn. Amber was inside finishing up her cake, and Fabia was confused by the unexpected turn. Dalton stopped by the barn door and turned to face her, his expression serious. But there was a glint of something in his eyes. "I'm not good." With fancy words, he began, his voice rough. "But I love you. Amber loves you. Will you marry me? Make this forever." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything stopped. Fabia's breath caught in her chest as her heart pounded in her ears. The quiet truth of his words settled in, and she realized she had been waiting for this moment, though she hadn't known it until now. She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, and without a word, she nodded. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The relief that washed over her was overwhelming. Dalton's smile was wide, his eyes shining as he took her hands in his, pulling her close. "You made me believe in love again," he said quietly. The wedding came a few weeks later, small and intimate, just the way Fabia had always imagined her life. Nothing extravagant, just the two of them, surrounded by the people who mattered. Amber was the flower girl, beaming with pride as she scattered petals down the aisle. Fabia walked toward Dalton, her heart full, and as they exchanged vows, she realized how far she had come. From a woman who thought she had nothing to offer to someone who was now part of a family, someone who was finally loved. The ceremony was held at the local church with a few townsfolk attending, some of whom had once whispered behind her back. But now there was nothing but acceptance. Even Mrs. Henderson, the gossip of the town, had brought flowers. The town had changed, and so had Fabia. She wasn't the broken woman who had come here months ago. She was a wife, a mother, a part of something whole. As the night fell and the celebration quieted, the three of them walked together, hand in hand, down the dirt road leading away from the church. Amber skipped ahead, a smile on her face, while Fabia and Dalton walked side by side, their hands close together. They passed the diner where Fabia had first met Amber, and the little girl's voice echoed her mind. "Remember when I asked if you wanted to meet my daddy?" Fabia laughed softly, squeezing Dalton's hand. "Best question anyone ever asked me." And then, as they passed the spot where Elias's shop had once stood, Fabia didn't flinch, didn't feel the need to hide. She was no longer just passing through. She belonged here with Dalton, and Amber in this town that had once judged her. As they reached the ranch, Fabia could feel the warmth of home wrapping around her. That night, as Amber slept soundly in her room, Fabia and Dalton sat on the porch swing, the stars shining brightly overhead. The world felt right, and for the first time in her life, Fabia realized that she was no longer running. She was finally, blessedly,